There are 10 bodies of knowledge in the project management body of knowledge 6th edition. And that body of knowledge is designed for project managers so that we have at our fingertips best practices. But those best practices are compartmentalized in their own knowledge area. This allows project managers to figure out, what do I need from each one of those areas? Now, most of us don't spend our entire projects trying to plan, execute, and monitor and control every single one of those 10 knowledge areas. But really, the bottom line here with those 10 bodies of knowledge is to allow the project manager to plan, execute, and monitor and control effectively, because it allows us to choose different processes based on the individual or unique needs of our projects. There are going to be some things that project managers use on every single project. We all have scope, maybe we all have schedules, and so on. But as you go through the individual knowledge areas, ask yourselves, what types of knowledge would I need from each one of those areas to help me better manage my projects? We'll start with integration. Integration management, to integrate. That's how I look at it. It's almost the umbrella or the bubble over all the other knowledge areas. It's what contains the best practices of development of a project charter. It's where your integrated project management plan and all its subsidiary plans and baselines live. This also helps direct and manage project execution. It controls integrated change so that we have a formal change control procedure, and it also outlines how to formally close out your project or phase. But in order to be truly integrated, we have to decide what other knowledge areas are necessary to plan for so that we can execute and monitor and control effectively. The next one being scope management. And clearly, scope is driving the train for everything else. It's the product scope, the project scope. It's what we collect requirements from. It's how we define what we will and will not do as far as scope of work is concerned. It allows everybody on the project to understand what success looks like. It's also important to make sure that that success is validated toward the end of the project or all the way through. Validate scope is basically getting formal acceptance of the end result, typically by a customer, but it could be internal or an end user or something of that nature. Without that validation of scope saying, hey, you're building the right thing, we cannot go through and formally close down our project. Scope of work, one of the big constraints, typically any changes to scope of work will drive changes to our schedule. In schedule management, this is where we define activities and we sequence events in logical order based on different dependencies. Meaning, is it logical to do it in this order? Do we have some flexibility there? Is it coming from the outside as a demand, contract, or a regulation? And so putting together your duration estimates and trying to figure out what's our schedule baseline. The baseline is basically the acceptance of our currently approved schedule that says, here's how long we think it should take to get everything done. Once we begin to execute project work, we're going to be keeping a close eye on that schedule baseline, and we're going to be comparing actuals. Well, it says in our baseline it should have taken 30 days. It took you 40 days. Now we can start to compare and contrast and see, have we bounced so far ahead or behind schedule that now we need to take some kind of corrective action? We always want to be keeping, usually weekly, an eye on our schedule, although not every project manager manages their own schedules, but it is more common than project managers managing multiple budgets. So when we look at cost management, that's really about estimating costs. Maybe you're not estimating costs for your individual human resources, but you are for equipment and or materials. That then allows us to estimate and budget and create a cost baseline. Scope, time, and cost are considered the three big constraints. If something changes in one, it typically affects the other. If you add scope of work, it could extend your schedule and expand your budget. That's why occasionally rebaselining will occur. but typically only through some kind of formal change control system. Now, the next thing is quality management, and not everybody works with quality management. Not everybody is doing a Lean Six Sigma type of setup at their organization. Not everybody has a quality assurance or quality control type of program in their organization. But I think I can safely say that all of us want to make sure that whatever we're producing is quality. The verification of quality in monitoring and controlling really is the first step prior to validation of scope. We want to make sure that both of those planets align. We want the verification that what we built is fit for use, that we build the thing right, and we also want validation of scope that we built the right thing. And both of those items will allow us to formally close out our project. But like I said, this is a knowledge area, and it might not be knowledge that you need for your current and or future projects. Communications, on the other hand, the communications management plan is basically trying to figure out what information do we need? What information, what people, what format, how often. We want to make sure that we're getting the right people, the right information in the right format at the right time. Communications management planning is definitely an important aspect. Project managers spend approximately 90% of our time communicating on projects, so it's important for everybody to know how that goes. We also want to make sure that we're following that plan and we're not just changing when we do status meetings because we thought we could. In fact, you would have to go through formal change control to update your communications management plan. You can't just say, we're going to do it on Thursday now when everybody's been doing it on Friday, and not give anybody a heads up. So communications management planning, definitely an important aspect of project management. Resource management involves people, equipment, and materials. Certainly you have human resource management, probably have a core team of people that you want to make sure that you're developing and managing and building a cohesive team that is high performing. But you might also be trying to figure out what materials and equipment are necessary to properly execute the project. That could be very tightly integrated with cost and procurement, especially if you're getting equipment, material, and maybe even staffing from outside your organization. It's important to have a plan for your resources, how you're going to develop them, how you're going to manage them, and if it's involved with cost in any way, shape, or form, that everything is aligned with that cost baseline. Risk can happen anywhere. This isn't an if, it's a when. There are two different kinds of risk categories. There are threats and there are opportunities. Well, opportunities are a bit harder to think about, but things like being first to market is an opportunity. Is it guaranteed? No. So there's a probability that it could happen and a good impact on the back end. Most of us are looking at threats. What are the things that can significantly impact any other knowledge area that we're working with? Is there a scope risk that will impact our time and our costs and our procurements and all of that? Risk management and creating some kind of risk register, a running tabulation of identified threats and opportunities, if you'd like, their probability, their impact, what response we've selected for them, who owns the response, meaning who's the risk owner, the people that will implement the response, not our job for everything, and also what triggers will we know are risk events coming, like a trigger. And the reason I'm stalling there is because usually it's hindsight. Usually when we identify a trigger, it's like after it happened, and you look back and you're like, oh, that's why that happened. But if you can identify triggers in advance, you'll want to document them in your risk register so that the risk owner knows it's go time. If it's hindsight is 2020 situation, always document the triggers for lessons learned. But risk can hide anywhere. Now, in procurement management, usually there are some risks based on different contract types. For example, if we're the buyer, fixed price contract agreements are great for us because we can budget for them. It just is what it is. But we need to pretty much know the scope of work to sign something like that. Cost reimbursable types of contracts, not so great. We carry a bit more on the risk side, but we still have some flexibility in scope, and we can set a ceiling price. We also have time and materials, maybe if we're trying to get staff or materials from other areas outside of our organization. Not a lot of project managers work with procurement. In fact, most organizations have a procurement department. But if your project itself was kicked off with a contract, it's a good idea to have some of those best practices in your back pocket so that you don't inadvertently breach contract, because it's our job to protect our organization from future litigation. But it's not our job to negotiate contracts. We'll leave that to the attorneys and the procurement department. Which brings us to our last knowledge area, which is stakeholder management. A lot of times, stakeholder management and communications management are overlapped. They're very tightly integrated. And I always tell my classes, in order to separate out these knowledge areas, even though they work together, is that communication is determining what information, where, how, and to whom. And stakeholder management is about relationships. It's about identifying your stakeholders' wants, interests, and needs, and making sure that we're trying to meet expectations. Does that happen from good communication? Absolutely. But does it also happen from building a stakeholder engagement plan that allows us to craft a relationship building plan for our stakeholders dependent upon their levels of power and interest in the project and their day-to-day? Using good communication is a way to do that. So now we've covered all 10 knowledge areas. We started with integration, scope, schedule, cost, communications, resource management, quality, risk, procurement, and stakeholder management. We have 10 bodies of knowledge, and within each one of those bodies of knowledge, there are numerous best practices. That's what makes the Project Management Body of Knowledge 6th edition so cool. And also, on top of the Project Management Body of Knowledge and all of those knowledge areas, there's also room for agile project management as well. There's some trends and best practices in each one of these knowledge areas in the new PMBOK guide and its companion, the Agile Practice Guide. So now, not only do we have knowledge areas for predictive or waterfall project management, we also now have knowledge areas for agile best practices as well. And if we want to create a hybrid, these best practices help lead the charge to make sure that all of our projects are effective. So those are the bodies of knowledge in the Project Management Body of Knowledge or PMBOK Guide 6th edition.